I want to talk to you today about trust. In my notes, trust is capitalized, by the way. I take for my text a comment from a Facebook thread a friend of mine posted where she says, "Friendly reminder, Russia didn't interfere with the 2016 elections." A long series of comments followed, mostly in agreement, but there were a few commentators that were holding fast to the official narrative. The germ of my thinking today is about this line. So we're no longer relying on U.S. intelligence sources or the intelligence coming from our allies? Close quote. That has stuck with me. It's stuck in my craw. I want to answer the fellow that posted it. Sir, I have not trusted U.S. intelligence sources for a very long time. I don't suppose I've ever trusted them to the degree that you do. But my mistrust was at a low level until I heard an episode of Fresh Air on NPR with Terry Gross, July 28, 2003, interviewing veteran New York Times foreign correspondent Stephen Kinzer. The subject was his then new book, All the Shah's Men, about the 1953 CIA coup d'etat in Iran, overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh, the very popular elected prime minister. Here's Kinzer summarizing the event before the Future of Freedom Foundation conference in 2008.
Well, it only took Kermit Roosevelt 3 weeks to organize the overthrow of the democratic government of Iran. It didn't just mean the end of Prime Minister Mossadegh's rule. It meant the end of democracy in Iran. Now, I think many people today don't even understand that Iran ever was a democracy. But in fact, this is a country that's had a constitution for more than 100 years. And in the early 50s, it really was consolidating its democracy. If we had managed to keep our hands off Iran, we might have had a thriving democracy in the heart of the Muslim Middle East all these 50 years. And I can hardly wrap my mind around how different the world would look if we had only managed to keep our hands off.
When I heard that NPR interview, which I link in the notes below, still on the web, by the way, my jaw hit the floor and it has never recovered. I've been a truther ever since. I was a truster, but now I only trust evidence. That's the only thing I agree with Reagan about. Trust but verify. Now, most of you remember the economy crashing in 2008, I'm sure. I want to lay a little groundwork here and refer to a piece in the Washington Post by Barry Ritholtz, which was published November 5th, 2011, titled, "What Caused the Financial Crisis? The Big Lie Goes Viral." Also linked in the notes. His phrase, "the big lie," is a quote from Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, chapter 10, which says, "All this was inspired by the principle which is quite true within itself, that in the big lie there is always a certain force of credibility. Because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. And thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have had the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver, and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down. A fact which is known to all expert liars in this world, and to all who conspire together in the art of lying." Now that's Hitler, but it's self-evidently true. So then Barry Ritholtz continues to explain the details of what really caused the financial crisis of 2008. But I want to cut to the chase. He says, the big lie made a surprise appearance Tuesday when New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, responding to a question about Occupy Wall Street, stunned observers by exonerating Wall Street. It was not the banks that created the mortgage crisis. It was, plain and simple, Congress who forced everybody to go and give mortgages to people who were on the cusp. Now, this is a text product that Ritholtz produced for Washington Post. But when he was interviewed on Max Keiser's show 2 weeks later, he condensed it to a very succinct point. Bankers are supposed to know what they're doing. They're supposed to know their job, supposed to have good sense. They have an obligation to manage risk. That's really all they're required to do. It's a science that's well established. The trouble is it's not profitable as gambling is. It's boring. Here's the nucleus of that interview.
All right, Barry, first let's talk about your piece in the Washington Post. What caused the financial crisis? The big lie goes viral. Tell us about it.
Well, there's been this tendency amongst people who helped create the crisis, and rather than admit that radical deregulation and allowing bankers to set their own rules and granting special exemptions for the 5 largest banks to ignore the leverage limitations, or allowing derivatives to be completely unregulated with no reserve requirements and no counterparty disclosures, rather than say, hey, this was really a big mistake, oops, instead they've created this false narrative, this argument that, you know what really caused the crisis? It was the government forcing banks to lend all that money to minorities and inner city poor people. That's what caused the crisis. The fascinating thing is the data overwhelmingly says that's not the case. We know they took leverage as soon as they were given permission from 12 to 1 to nearly 50 to 1. We know that they engaged in all sorts of speculative activity where they didn't understand the risks. Their models were just wildly optimistic. They were so busy counting profits and bonuses that they didn't pay attention to the bottom line. Look, it all comes down to some very, very simple rules. Banking is supposed to be boring. The job of a banker is to make decisions about who is creditworthy and who is not. To give you an idea of how reckless the banking industry became, not only did they create these no-doc loans, they stopped validating loan to value of the home. They stopped evaluating credit scores. And most importantly, they stopped asking borrowers how much money they earned. And that is the single most important factor in determining if someone's going to repay a mortgage or a loan. How much do they actually earn? Can they service that debt? So when I hear this nonsensical things, banks were forced to make loans to poor people, nobody told the banks, don't check income, don't check credit rating, don't check all the usual metrics that have worked for thousands of years. It's just nonsense. And when I see people propagating the big lie like that, it makes me stop and say, what are these guys hiding? And it's pretty clear what they've been hiding. They have an intellectually bankrupt ideology, and it's causing global damage to the economy.
And when I see people propagating the big lie like that, it makes me stop and say, what are these guys hiding? It's pretty clear they've been hiding that they have an intellectually bankrupt ideology and is causing global damage to the economy. Well, you know, that's all quite true. That's a big lie. And I heard it from many right-wingers at the time, both in person and in the media. Dodd-Frank is to blame. Congress is to blame. They forced these poor, honest bankers to make loans to people who wouldn't repay. As Ritholtz makes clear, when a loan recipient defaults on a loan, it is really the banker's fault for not doing his job, or his or her job, of assessing the risk. What are they, children? Okay, great. Well, that's a big lie, yes, but it's not the big lie. The actual big lie is that Wall Street planned the crash. Oh, yes. Take a look at this. From McClatchy, which, if you don't know, is pretty much the only consistently high-quality news publisher left. They took over from Knight Ridder, who previously upheld that standard. Quote, in 2006 and 2007, Goldman Sachs Group peddled more than $40 billion in securities backed by at least 200,000 risky home mortgages, but never told the buyers it was secretly betting that a sharp drop in the U.S. housing prices would send the value of those securities plummeting. Goldman's sales and its clandestine wagers, completed at the brink of the housing market meltdown, enabled the nation's premier investment bank to pass most of its potential losses to others before a flood of mortgage defaults staggered the U.S. and global economies. Only later did investors discover what Goldman had promoted as AAA-rated investments were closer to junk. Now, pension funds, insurance companies, labor unions, and foreign financial institutions that bought these dicey mortgage securities, they're thinking they're going to get a modest profit on them, right? Are facing, this is at the time, large losses, and a 5-month McClatchy investigation has found that Goldman's failure to disclose that it made secret exotic bets on an imminent housing crash may have violated securities laws. The Securities and Exchange Commission should be very interested in any financial company that secretly decides a financial product is a loser and then goes out and actively markets that product, or very similar products to unsuspecting customers without disclosing its true opinion, said Lawrence Kotlikoff, a Boston University economics professor who's proposed a massive overhaul of the nation's banks. This is fraud and it should be prosecuted. John Coffey, a Columbia University law professor who served on an advisory committee to the New York Stock Exchange, said that investment banks have wide latitude to manage their assets, and so the legality of Goldman's maneuvers depends on what its executives knew at the time. It would look much more damaging, Coffey said, if it appeared that the firm was dumping these investments because it saw them as toxic waste and virtually worthless. Lloyd Blankfein, Goldman's chairman and chief executive, declined to be interviewed for this article. A Goldman spokesman, Michael Duvalli, said that the firm decided in December 2006 to reduce its mortgage risks, and did so by selling off subprime-related securities and making myriad insurance-like bets called credit default swaps to hedge against a housing downturn. Duvalli said, told McClatchy that Goldman had no obligation to disclose how it was managing its risk, kind of like the DNC has no obligation to be fair to Bernie Sanders, right? Had no obligation to disclose how it was managing its risk, nor would investors have expected us to do so. Other market participants had access to the same information we did. For the past year, Goldman has been on the defensive over its Washington connections and the billions in federal bailout it received. Scant attention has been paid, however, to how it became the only major Wall Street player to extricate itself from the subprime securities market before the housing bubble burst. Goldman remains, along with Morgan Stanley, one of two venerable Wall Street venerable? I don't venerate them. One of two venerable Wall Street investment banks still standing. Their grievously wounded peers, Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch, fell into the arms of retail banks, while another, Lehman Brothers, folded. To piece together Goldman's role in the subprime meltdown, McClatchy reviewed hundreds of documents, SEC filings, copies of secret investment circulars, lawsuits, and interviewed numerous people familiar with the firm's activities. McClatchy's inquiry found that Goldman Sachs bought and converted into high-yield bonds tens of thousands of mortgages from some subprime lenders that became the subjects of FBI investigations into whether they'd misled borrowers or exaggerated applicants' incomes to justify making hefty loans. So you see, it was not the Congress that forced the poor bankers to make loans that they feared would fail. Neither was it incompetence, that they were not paying attention and really, really screwed up. No, it was intentional. It was robbery of the whole people of the United States and the world, for that matter. The biggest name in the story was John Paulson, which McClatchy didn't mention. In fact, a New York Times article is titled, "Investor Who Made Billions is Not Target of Suit." The New York Times said, 3.5 years ago, a New York hedge fund manager with a bearish view on the housing market was pounding the pavement on Wall Street, eager to increase his bets against subprime mortgages. These are called short options. These are futures, which originally, were created to help people like, especially farmers, who suffered when the price of grain would, or some other commodity, would suddenly collapse. Say Canada all of a sudden started shipping grain into the United States, and the price went way down because there's plenty of supply. So a farmer could be ruined by that drop in price. Is that all he had? Is that field full of grain? So they would buy futures contracts from a market maker, and for a price, he would guarantee that he would promise to buy their crop at the price it was running for at the time of the contract. If it went down, they still get their money. If it went up, well, the market maker profits, but they still survive. The farmer still survives. So those are futures, but they have been turned into instruments of gambling. So anyway, the New York Times continues. The investor John A. Paulson canvassed firm after firm looking for new ways to profit from home loans that he was sure would go sour. Only a few investment banks agreed to help him. One was Deutsche Bank. The other was the mighty Goldman Sachs. Mr. Paulson struck gold. His prescience made him billions and transformed him from a relative nobody into something of a celebrity on Wall Street and in Washington. But now his brassy bets have thrust Mr. Paulson into an uncomfortable spotlight. On Friday, the Securities Exchange Commission filed a civil fraud lawsuit against Goldman for neglecting to tell its customers that mortgage investments they were buying consisted of pools of dubious loans that Mr. Paulson had selected because they were highly likely to fail. Here, Goldman, create a fund of total rotten junk and let me bet against it, okay? Okay? And they did. By betting against the pool of questionable mortgage bonds, Mr. Paulson made $1 billion when they collapsed just a few months later. Aha! I told you they were going to collapse. The SEC said, investors who bought what regulators are essentially calling a pig in a poke lost that amount. And these are universities, unions, pension funds that needed a little steady profit on their cash. They lost it all. So now we've come to the end of part 1 of trust, and we're beginning part 2. Remember, I started this piece talking about the CIA, the intelligence agencies, as Julian Assange said in a press conference in March.
But the Central Intelligence Agency is the largest intelligence agency in the world. Now, it's an an organization with tens of thousands of people. There's many good people in there. There's internal divisions about some of the unethical practices that have been conducted. And every country that wants to be independent and determine its own CIA should be broken into 1,000 pieces and splintered to the wind because it had gotten so out of control. This lack of control comes about in a very obvious manner. You have a secretive agency, and secrecy, of course, breeds corruption normally, but you have an agency which trains its people to lie and to engage in cover-ups and clandestine activities. So already you have an agency whose staff receive values and expertise that make them very hard to manage and very hard for there to be internal accountability. And then, because the CIA crept from being an agency which reports on what is going in the world, potentially a positive thing to understand the world and produce comprehensible reports about what is occurring, to an agency which reports on the world and then commits actions to overthrow governments, to influence elections. The Cornell University report from last year says that the Central Intelligence Agency and associated agencies in the United States since 1949 have interfered in more than 81 elections around the world, not including coups. It then became an agency which reported on its own activities in the world and recommended what activities to conduct.
Now, Julian says the CIA crept from intel to what Prouty calls fun and games. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty was the first ever liaison between the then new Joint Chiefs of Staff and the then new CIA. So his point of view is essential to anyone who wants to understand this dangerous operation. In his excellent book, The Secret Team, available for free download at radical.org, so named for the founder, David T. Ratcliffe, Prouty says in Chapter 4, referring to the National Security Act of 1947, which parted off the Marines from the Navy and the Air Force from the Army Air Corps, i.e. 5 services from 3, thus the Pentagon, also created the National Security Council and the post of National Security Advisor and the Central Intelligence Agency, which Truman later complained that he thought it was all about intelligence. In a Washington Post op-ed less than a month after Kennedy's murder, Truman wrote, "For some time I've been disturbed by the way the CIA has diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. This has led to trouble and may have compounded our difficulties in several explosive areas. I never had any thought that when I set up the CIA, it would be injected into peacetime cloak and dagger operations. Some of the complications and embarrassment I think we have experienced are in part attributable to the fact that this quiet, intelligent arm of the president has been so removed from its intended role that it is being interpreted as a symbol of sinister and mysterious foreign intrigue and a subject for Cold War enemy propaganda." But Prouty goes into the nature of the creep that Julian talks about from intel to fun and games, just how it happened, as I say, in Chapter 4 of Secret Team. When the law was passed, it contained no provision whatever, either for collection of intelligence or for clandestine activities. However, it did contain one clause that left the door ajar, he says, for later interpretation and exploitation. The CIA was created by the NSA 47 and placed under the direction of the NSC, a committee. This same act had established the NSC at the same time. Therefore, the CIA's position relative to the NSC was without practice and precedent. But the law was specific in placing the agency under the direction of that committee, and in not placing the agency in the office of the president and directly under his control. That was intentional. In conclusion, this act provided that among the duties the CIA would perform, it would, this is the last of a list of 5, it would perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the NSC may from time to time direct. This was the inevitable loophole. And as time passed and as the CIA and the ST, the secret team, grew in power and know-how, they tested this clause in the act and began to practice their own interpretation of its meaning. They believed that it meant they could practice clandestine operations. Their perseverance paid off. During the summer of 1948, the NSC issued a directive number 10/2, which authorized special operations with 2 stipulations. A, such operations must be secret. And B, such operations must be plausibly deniable. These were important prerequisites. We don't want this coming back on us. If you get caught, you're on your own. The CIA really worked at the achievement of this goal toward unlimited and unrestrained covert operations. In its earlier years, the directors, Admiral Sowers and General W.B. Smith, that's Beetle Smith, they called him. It's spelled Bedell, but they pronounced it Beetle, were preoccupied with the task of getting the agency organized. See, they weren't into that. These were military men, with beating down the traditional opposition of the older members of the community, and with performing their primary function, that of coordinating national intelligence. However, with the advent of the Allen Dulles era, ever-increasing pressure was placed on the restraints that bound covert operations. Dulles succeeded in freeing the agency from these fetters, to such an extent that 5 years after his departing from the agency, the retiring DCI, Admiral Rayborn, was so conditioned to the CIA party line that he could not quote the law correctly. That's the end of a quote there from The Secret Team by L. Fletcher Prouty. It is very important that you notice the name of Dulles being the key to the transgression of the intended boundary. Transgression means to step across, to walk across. From gradior, to walk. The Dulles brothers are really the key to the downfall of the United States. Yes. Here's a snippet of that history. In 1917, Foster Dulles, who was later, and at that time, he was Secretary of State. This is under Eisenhower. It was called the Cadillac Cabinet because of all the rich men that were in the cabinet. In 1917, Foster Dulles was already a partner at the still biggest Wall Street law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. This is not a law firm you go to get a contract. Hold on a second. I want to show you something. This is a book about Sullivan and Cromwell. They are a law unto themselves. So let's see. This is not a law firm that you go to get a contract drawn up or to represent you in court. They are there to lean on small countries who aren't doing what their clients would like to see. This is a quote. I'm going to read you a quote from an awesome book, again by my favorite Stephen Kinzer, called The Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and Their Secret World War. A pro-American regime in Cuba, led by the Conservative Party, was seeking to hold power after losing an election, and followers of the victorious liberals rose up in protest. Violence threatened the interests of the 13 Sullivan and Cromwell clients, owners of sugar mills, railways, and mines, who had 170 million, the equivalent of $3 billion in the early 21st century, invested in Cuba. You remember this is not long after the Spanish-American War when we seized Cuba. These investors turned to the firm for protection. That's why they hired Sullivan and Cromwell. Foster took the case and traveled immediately to Washington. He was in New York. The next morning, he had breakfast with Uncle Bert. That's his uncle, Secretary of State Robert Lansing. This is under Woodrow Wilson. By his own account, he suggested that the Navy Department send 2 fast destroyers, one for the northern coast and one for the southern coast of the portion of Cuba controlled by revolutionaries. Lansing agreed, and the warships were dispatched that afternoon. Marines landed and spread into the countryside to repress protests, beginning what would be a 5-year occupation. Liberals realized the futility of resistance and called off their uprising. This was the first foreign intervention in which Foster played a role. This is baby shoes. And it showed him how easy it can be for a rich and powerful country, guided by the wishes of its wealthiest corporations, to impose its will on a poor and weak one. Okay, before I sign off, let me read you one more quote. This is from Peter Dale Scott's important book, The Road to 9/11, Wealth, Empire, and the Future of America. The reason I'm reading you this is because I want to tie this together. You realize that I started out talking about the CIA, and then here I am talking about Wall Street. This is why. Scott says, from 1945 to 1947, elements of the U.S. Army conspired to maintain contacts with former German anti-communists in Europe and their German army commander, General Reinhard Gehlen. He was actually the spy chief, the Nazi spy chief. 5 men were involved, of whom 3, William J. Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, the leader of the OSS, the intelligence agency of the Second World War. William J. Donovan, Allen Dulles, and Frank Wisner were representatives of the Wall Street overworld, a good word that Scott uses, and also of the New York Social Register, which listed the members of New York high society. This is who we're dealing with. They were awaiting a new agency to succeed Donovan's Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and take over the Nazis' ethnic armies in Eastern Europe. But the idea of a centralized intelligence agency encountered fierce competitive opposition from the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, who was backed at first by elements of Army intelligence. Now, naval intelligence is the oldest intelligence in the country, just for the record. Although it took 2 years to overcome their opponents, the Wall Street lawyers and bankers in Truman's administration succeeded in 1947 in establishing CIA. The Wall Street lawyers and bankers in Truman's administration succeeded in 1947 in establishing CIA. The forebears of John Paulson and of Lloyd Blankfein, which would report to the president through the new National Security Council. This new agency, based on the precedent and personnel of the OSS, had been urged on Washington by the War Peace Studies project of the Council on Foreign Relations, which was founded after the First World War. It was urged on them by the CFR in the early 40s. It was reinforced by a report commissioned in 1945 by Navy Secretary James V. Forrestal. The report was written by Ferdinand Eberstadt, who, like Forrestal, was a private Wall Street banker from the investment bank Dillon Reed. As CIA Director Richard Helms narrates in his memoirs, now Richard Magara Helms is the grandson of Gates Magara, the first chief of the Reparations Bank, which was put together by Hjalmar Schacht, that was Hitler's banker and finance minister, double-hatted, and Bank of England, Montague Norman. Gates Magara was the first chief of that bank, the Reparations Bank, to do reparations after the First World War, which later became known as the Bank for International Settlements, which is the Bank of Banks in Switzerland, in Basel. Richard Helms, as CIA Director Richard Helms narrates in his memoirs, Allen Dulles, then a Republican lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell, or his brother was partner, in New York, was recruited in 1946, quote, to draft proposals for the shape and organization of what was to become the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. Dulles promptly formed an advisory group of 6 men, all but one of whom were Wall Street investment bankers or lawyers. In 1948, Forrestal appointed Dulles chairman of a committee along with 2 other New York lawyers to review CIA's performance. The 3 lawyers conferred for close to a year in one of the boardrooms at J.H. Whitney, another Wall Street investment firm. In its first 2 decades, CIA, like its intellectual parent, the Council on Foreign Relations, was dominated internally and externally by the aristocratic elements of the New York overworld. All 7 of the known deputy directors of CIA during this period came from the same New York legal and financial circles, and 6 of them were listed in the New York Social Register as well, dear. Don't you know? Well, dear, he's just a wonderful hairdresser, said the old dowager, dripping with diamonds and wrinkles. When joined by the young James Angleton, son of international corporate executive, James Jesus Angleton, his mother was Latina. This early corps became the basis for an inner agency within an agency that survived into the 60s. Now that's Peter Dale Scott quoting Richard Helms, who took over after one step removed after Dulles left, who was fired by Kennedy. So that's who they are. They are the same people that rigged the junk mortgages so they could steal $1 billion from people, ruin millions of lives, take their homes, their savings, their children's college, their health care. That's why it's easy to understand how they could overthrow 81 countries and then bitch about Russia, saying unkind things about Hillary, which there's not even any evidence of. This is why I repeat John F. Kennedy's call: shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter to the winds. That's how we get our country back. As old Senator Sam Ervin told a reporter in the hallway during Watergate, of which committee he was chairman, quoting John 3:19. This is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds are evil. Thanks for listening.